Welcome back to another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. We are your hosts, Sarah and Bosco, and on today's episode, we had the amazing opportunity to talk to Dr. Cath Goulding about the incredible work she's engaged in within the educational realm. Her scholarship is centered on public pedagogy, the teaching of historical trauma, and essentially place-based education. We are very excited to have you on our podcast.
Dr. Cath Goulding, welcome to another Education is Possible. How are you doing?
I am very well. I am joining in from Queens, New York City. Dusk is falling over Queens, and the chill is in the fall air tonight. So I feel a sort of spooky feeling of this fall season coming along, and it is right alongside my Scorpio mood and heart. So I am doing well now that it feels a bit more chilly.
Yeah, I've definitely been feeling that cool October air, and it's been very spooky to go out, but it's fun that way. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. As I mentioned, I am a resident of the borough of Queens, but it was not always so. I don't know if I can identify as a New Yorker, but I've been here since 2010, but very much still feel like an outsider to the Northeast. I'm originally from the Los Angeles, California metro region, which is a massive sprawl, suburban sprawl for the most part. And I grew up very much in the land, San Fernando Valley, strip malls, and mattress superstores, and excellent Vietnamese food. So originally from the Los Angeles suburb, and for many, many years have that upward lilt and the vocal fry that you hear in a lot of reality TV stars, because I'm right from that region of the country. But I think you can tell me, Dr. Corson, and you all, actually Bosco and Sarah, if I've tamped down on that upward lilt, the Valley girl. I grew up there, still identify very much as a Californian with my politics and sort of attitudinally. But I was also a teacher, as many of you are who are participating in the podcast production. I was a mostly 10th, but I taught 11th and 12th grade too, English language arts teacher. And that was my own first initiation to Holocaust and genocide studies. It was doing an institute for genocide studies, teaching the Holocaust through facing history in ourselves. That was one of the first professional learning experiences. And for all of my years as a high school teacher, taught Holocaust literatures and literatures of witness. That was the sort of unit I called it. Primarily taught Elie Wiesel's Night and Art Spiegelman's Mouse, but also came to integrate lots of other kinds of mass violence. I was studying the Cambodian genocide through first-person narration, and also looking at something that was happening at the time was, I was a teacher, was a genocide in Darfur, the Sudan. So having my students study one that was actively happening alongside reading these texts and doing kind of different civic campaigns, letter writing campaigns. So yeah, I also have kind of that, the beginning of my intellectual life was in that field of genocide studies. After teaching, as Dr. Corson, your professor, alluded to, I moved to New York City to undergo a doctoral program in curriculum studies. And that's where I am now. I'm currently a professor of social studies methods and a co-director of an education project around Japanese American history and memory. But I'll talk about that more in this interview, I think.
That sounds awesome. We also wanted to ask you, we know that a lot of your work consists of going into detail about the structure and the architecture of concentration and many camps in general. Are you able to tell us exactly concentration and internment camps?
Yes, absolutely. I can tell you some definitional and conceptual ideas behind this idea. What is the concentration camp? What is an internment camp? And what are the distinctions between those two terms? That comes up a lot when we examine the concentration camp or the prison camp in the context, the particular history that my family underwent, which is the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. For a very long time, we used the term internment camps to talk about this history. It's still a term that's widely used, but it's actually a bit of a misnomer because, but it was it was a term, it was an official government term for the camp that existed and incarcerated over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent. And really, an internment camp it's a designation that is for prisoners of war. So when prisoners are taken and there's an active armed engagement, and one army or one entity takes prisoners of war and puts them in a concentrated prison, you would call that an internment camp. And usually they're reserved for the exchange of other prisoners of war from the other side. But it's typically about, in armed engagement, soldiers are taken, right? And that is the area that they are held in while they await, right, some end to the violent conflict. Similar in structure, similar in architecture, quite different definition of prisoner is the concentration camp. And you all study this deeply, but a concentration camp just simply refers to a zone. It's a zone in which people who are considered no longer worthy of a political life are brought to be segregated from the rest of the social world. A zone of isolation. It's a zone where undesirables or people who are, for a variety of reasons, are considered a threat to the state, for the most part. And these places are often very much out of public view. They tend to be very secretive. There's not a lot of information to the people outside the camp about what's going on there. They tend to be in, not surprisingly, remote areas, right? Or public lands in the case of Japanese American incarceration sites. So, yeah, I think the distinction is really between internment and concentration camp is that internment really refers to soldiers or people who are actively in a war. And that certainly didn't apply to Japanese Americans. They weren't soldiers, they weren't engaged in armed conflict. They were, for the most part, 2/3 of them were citizens. They're just ordinary people living their lives and were put in these camps. So to call them internment camp, it really upsets a lot of people whose families were involved in this history because it insinuates that they were in some way doing something, right, nefarious, that they were involved in a armed or possibly violent conflict, that they're spies. That was the whole argument. And there was absolutely never any proof that anyone in this community was involved in espionage. It's funny, little things are big, right? It seems a little bit silly to quibble over these terms, but the use of the word internment really insinuates that there was a certain amount of agency involved in who was put in these camps. So the correct term would be prison camp or concentration camp. So that it's interesting that you all are in genocide studies looking at, Holocaust history and memory. I think there's always been a thread of controversy between like Holocaust scholars and Japanese American historians and educators and museum workers. I mean, that's been a definite tension, right? Some members in Holocaust studies have found that concentration camp should not be applied to talking about Japanese American incarceration. So there's been that sort of debate, ongoing debate. But as far as I just take the stance that the Japanese American National Museum takes, that it is an appropriate term to call these spaces. But like I said, not without some degree of tension among the academics.
I do agree with you that there is definitely tension within that conversation, and it's really appreciative to hear your take on it. And I also wanted to ask you kind of a personal question. I know you have a personal connection to the Japanese concentration camps. Do you mind sharing with us what that connection is?
Yeah, and one thing I've always enjoyed about coming to your chorus and talking to Dr. Corson's students is that oftentimes, I mean, obviously not, we do this work out of a deep sense of ethics and care. And a lot of us are motivated, right, by our family history and our family having undergone some kind of major turmoil, some forced removal, or even faced direct death and harm as denizens being target of the state. And I think each one of you, I would guess, has some sort of personal relationship to that kind of history. But you can tell me more offline. Absolutely. I think it's funny because you would think like, oh, how could one moment in time of my mother and my grandparents and their generation fuel a lifetime of work in my own life? But in fact, it has. I do think that my lifelong intellectual work, my lifelong work as an educator directly stems from this moment in history in 1943 when my mother was born in a concentration camp in what we call it Denson, Arkansas. And I actually just went there for the first time. And I'd be happy to talk about visiting it for the first time in April. I went there for this event, and it was very astonishing to finally walk the place my mother was born. But I don't know if you've ever been to Arkansas, but it's an incredibly rural place. It's mostly farmland. And the US government decided that it would be a good place to build a concentration camp for Japanese Americans who were coming from the West Coast. It's funny, I learned more and more about it when I was there in April, but some states actually bid the Wartime Relocation Authority, which was just the body that set up all of these camps during World War II. They bid for the actual contract to have camps in their states because with concentration camps and as with jails or any other major prison industrial complex, it brings jobs, it brings labor, it brings a certain amount of funding to develop these places that are oftentimes very rural and there's not much there. So that's why she was in Arkansas. It was a lot by chance. This is where the camp was built. There was two of Jerome and Rower, and she was born there in Denson. And yeah, it was there. They were there for 2 years and eventually were released in 1944 to go to another camp, which was in Arizona. So a lot of the story of this history it really is a story of forced movement across the American landscape. It's a very geographically place-driven story. And it's a story of some of the most rural and very poor areas of our country that become these become small cities of prisoners. And that's a whole other story that I'd love to get into, but you wouldn't believe how much land development, agricultural development happens in these concentration camps. Because of prison labor, it seems like there's always like so many other rationales for building these places. It's on the one hand, it's right, let's secure this threat. Well, no, we're also going to use the prisoners to develop this land, dig agricultural ditches, make it suitable for farming. So many layers in just these single prison sites. That's why I think it has become a lifelong intellectual work, I think, for anyone who engages these kinds of histories.
So to dig more into the experiences of the Japanese being sent to these concentration camps, that's a very disruptive process, uprooting their lives, especially with children who were taken and also born there. And I do wonder how the children and even the kids born there, how do they continue their education, right? Was there education in these camps? Were there like formal schools? How did the parents try to educate even like newborns and toddlers?
Bosco, that's just a terrific question. You know, and I think I can remember from when I used to teach the Holocaust that there were certainly camps that were dedicated to children's education, I should say, quote unquote, and sort of being model camps where this is how we were treating prisoners when they had officials visit, and they have art programs. they're doing all these things. They become kind of media, like PR spectacles too. It's funny, like a lot of the camp wanted to seem like humane places. And I think that happened too in the case of World War II Japanese American incarceration, where different kinds of officials created propaganda videos about productive labor, children demonstrating allegiance with the American flag. You can see a lot of these photos that were taken both by government photographers in sort of propagandistic ways, but also in ways that were very subversive, like Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams were hired. So there's so much, a trove of archival data that shows what children were doing for the span of 1943 to sometimes 1946 and later in these different kinds of prison camps. There were all kinds of them, from very small to very large, like small cities. But in all cases, there were children present. And in fact, of the 120,000 more that were incarcerated, a third were children. So a third of prisoners were children. And of course, there were babies that were born in the camps as well, which was the case of my own mother. I think absolutely, like childbirth in the camp was much more risky and dangerous, given that a lot of these camps were in rural areas and there was very limited access to hospitals, but a lot of prisoners themselves served as the doctors, right, for the camp. And you see this process of education and the care for children emerging very, very early on in this history. I can speak to children's education if you want to, but there was education, as you all well know, happening on so many levels. There was really, really fascinating art education that was happening from the earliest days of the incarceration. As prisoners became more situated and sure of I would say not even sure, that's the wrong word, uncertain about when they would be able to leave these places, you start to see more formal education start to emerge and the hiring of teachers from within the camps themselves, but also bringing in teacher forces and hiring them and paying them federal wages from outside the areas around the camp. And you see totally formal institutions. And to this day, you can enter in archives and read teachers' curriculum. You can look at their grade books. You can look at a treasure trove of writings by K through 12 students, especially the secondary students, of course, but also looking at drawing by children. All these things exist. And some of them are just kind of sitting in archives waiting for the right researchers like yourselves to pick them up and analyze what schooling was like. And I've seen a few of these, and I can talk about those if you'd like. If I could talk more specifically about any of these kind of educational interventions. I recently did a project around the art schools in the camp. So I could start there. I could also talk about ways that they supported the littlest children in the camps as well. So you tell me where you want to go.
I think hearing about the art would be really interesting, especially since art really does cut across ages and it's not typically seen as like a right, it's not seen as like a standard method of education. There's obviously art classes, but I think it's an interesting area to see how they were expressed themselves in such an isolated space.
Yeah, Bosco, I'm 100% with you. I think there's always been an interest in the art that emerges from prisoners and prison spaces. But in the case of the Japanese American incarceration, because many of them were just ordinary citizens and workers of all kinds, but you did have a group of prisoners, Japanese American prisoners, who were extraordinarily successful artists, commercial artists, landscape architects, sculptors, animators and professors of art who were incarcerated and took it upon themselves from the earliest days of their forced removal to create art guilds and art classes. And one of the most famous ones is called the Tanforan School, and later became the Topaz Art School. And this school was started by Obata, who was a professor of art and already very like nationally recognized painter. when he was incarcerated. But him and a group of artists took it upon themselves at Tanforan, which was one of the first things always, right, in gathering prisoners, is they have to sort of concentrate them in these like spaces. And then they sort of decide what to do, right? They're temporary spaces. And this was a temporary space in a horse stalls. It's called Tanforan. And started these art guilds. And you were already seeing the teachers start to offer painting classes, music classes, weaving. And in some cases, these early classes actually launched the career of a lot of artists. You may know the artist Ruth Asawa. She's quite beautiful and it now has a huge retrospective that's at the San Francisco MoMA. She's kind of getting her due at long last, but she creates these gorgeous woven sculptures that sort of the light flickers off of. And some of her earliest education was at these type of schools. And she eventually learned to put these skills to use as a professional artist at the Black Mountain College. It's interesting. Art still manages to thrive. And for many of these people in the camp, I learned as I was doing this big curriculum project around some of these artists, it became a way not only for reflection and making sense of the camp itself, but actually bolstered them professionally. Like so many of them would go on to do things, pretty incredible things at Disney as animators or background artists for major animation labels or becoming architects or again producing myriad art. And they also had art exhibitions that they held within the camp and outside the camp too. So there's a level of organization there and a level of absolute professionalism that we see happening in the concentration camp. And I think the thing that it sort of begs the question for me is, to what extent were these guilds modes of survival, modes of dealing with the boredom and the sort of quietude of these rural spaces? And to what extent was it had its own educational aims and the freedom to create spaces within the most restrictive environments for learning? That's the contradiction that I know you explore in Dr. Corson's class, which is, can prison camp, in all of their repressive, inglorious, desperate state, can there also be this opportunity for liberation and teaching amongst the prisoners? And it turns out, I guess I'm answering my own question, that there are lots of spaces are incredibly liberating within the prison camp.
I was just wondering, with art and other education that they had, was there oversight from the United States authorities? Did they see what they were doing? Did they try to manage what they were learning, what they were doing, or was there more freedom for them, for the intern to try and experiment and maybe still retain some of their like cultural values and teachings?
So I don't know totally the answer to your question about the extent to which the schools were regulated and standardized. I have seen some evidence there was formal hirings of the teaching staff. And that was the thing that I learned when I was in Arkansas visiting Jerome, where my mother was born, they have like a tiny little museum in the town adjacent to where the camp was. And it's just so funny. These Southerners, this is like Bill Clinton territory, but these white Southerners who kind of live in that area, they took a lot of them, like, not a lot, but like, it's sort of like there's a lot of like local history production around Japanese American incarceration. And in this Southern town, they have like a tiny like local history museum that's dedicated to it. And, they have like a very small, like tight drumming group, one in the whole state of Arkansas. And they come and perform at this local museum. It's just like one of those things that you're like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe this is here. But anyway, I learned in this very tiny museum, a lot of like people who have a direct relationship to workers at the camp, like administrators and people who worked at the camp and were paid a salary by the federal government, donate like all of these personal artifacts to these local history museums. So I'm just like looking through all these essentially photo albums, these like mid-century photo albums that are entirely black paper. And in it are just pasted all of these photos. And when I saw some of these photos, I thought, oh, I got to call Jordan, or I got to call Dr. Porson and tell him, because there was like a teacher that sent her album in. And it was like, I mean, it was totally mind blowing to me because the teachers had their own quarters. I learned that the teachers who were hired in Arkansas to teach Japanese American K through 12 classes, it was such a desirable job because they were making much higher wages than you would at a local school in Arkansas, a public school, because they paid them on a federal level. It was a federal contract. So you would see all these images of these white teaching staff, white Arkansas, like Southern teaching staff. They just seem like they're having a ball. There's like Christmas parties. You see them in their dormitories, which were inside the camps and were significantly nicer than the other barracks prisoners, of course. And then you have these like relationships that were formed between the teachers and the students, actually quite powerful relationships. And I've seen other documentaries where the teachers will like still remember their Japanese American student. And there's that bond there, a bond that would happen between classroom teachers and their students outside of the prison camp. The normal, I guess, quote unquote, the normal structures of life outside of the camp replicating themselves inside the space of the camp. And again, I'm not sure. I guess it just to me is that one of the most strange contradictions of these spaces is that there were extraordinary bonds between the teachers and the students in some cases, and that they maintained touch, that these teachers, in fact, documented their students' experience, saved their artwork, and would later donate it to places like these local history museums. So again, it just raises questions about, were the staff as educators there complicit with what was happening? Yes, on a certain level, but on other levels, they are still doing the work, this care work of these young Japanese American kids. So that's just another level that happens. It happens on a very official, organized way, education, but it also happens in a way that's driven by the prisoners themselves. Both are just offer rich possibilities for looking at, I think, the ironies of education in and outside the camp. It's funny because like we could talk about the same thing in the context of like urban schooling and like white teachers and really not sharing a background with their students. So of course these things play out, but they're sort of heightened within a concentration camp setting. And I think in some ways, education becomes all the more meaningful and requisite, I think, in a concentration camp for kids.
I'm actually really shocked at like learning that information because I hadn't known that education within these camps were, there's so many different dimensions to it. And it's unfortunate because I wish they had taught this in school when I was going through elementary school, high school. These are things that you just aren't taught. So I guess my next question is really focusing on how this is taught in our schools today. How do you think that the Japanese concentration camps should be taught in our education system? Because it is mentioned while studying World War II. However, it's a short definition that's taught to these kids per the curriculum, and that's kind of it. They don't go into detail. They maybe show 1 to 2 pictures, but there is definitely more that they can go off of. So I really want to hear your take on this.
Yeah, thanks for asking about the way that Japanese American incarceration, in a way, the instruction of it is also a sort of intellectual interest of mine, is looking at the history of this curriculum around it, what it has looked like, where it sits in the wider field of teaching Asian American studies. One of the really, I think, astounding things for second generation Japanese Americans whose parents were in the camp, and just like many genocide survivors or survivors of a lot of traumatic events, their parents never told them about this, right? There's this there's this particular silence around it. And occasionally you'll hear civil rights figures like Fred Korematsu's daughter, Sharon Korematsu, say that the first time she learned about her father, who's really famous for resisting the camps, actually. He refused to go and was the subject of a Supreme Court case. He was the subject of a Supreme Court case that he lost that basically legalized incarcerations of citizens. I mean, it's really scary. But she said she didn't learn about her father until he was in a textbook in school. And you'll hear other cases of this too, where they sort of knew their parents went through this during World War II, but they saw it mentioned in a textbook for the first time in the kind of post-World War II era. So like the 1970s, 1980s, maybe 1960s, as early as that. You start seeing it in textbooks. And of course, after the 1980s, when a very hard-fought struggle for reparations, for public apology was legalized and it was signed into law by, it was President Reagan in 1988. You see it actually because it becomes institutionalized in that way, there's certain requirements, right, to teach this kind of history. There's public funds that are set up through like the National Park Service, through various civil rights funds that have come to fund these kind of works through grants. I think that's really the genesis of Japanese American incarceration history. It comes out of a very hard struggle to demand apology. And then you start to see it happen, appear much more in curriculum and documentary films and all kinds of preservation of historic sites. And now as we're seeing huge, very expensive, kind of prominent art exhibitions by Japanese American artists like Ruth Asawa. And then there's one right now that's really beautiful. It's at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. They have this beautiful exhibit of 3 Japanese American women artists who have a relation, who are either incarcerated or barely avoided incarceration. All of these things are kind of happening as it unfolds over a decade. But the question was right about how you asked me how it's taught. I think it tends to be very brief, like all critical social studies talk. It's like one day, and you look at a couple of probably Dorothea Lange photos or Ansel Adams photos, and they sort of talk about like how tragic it was. I mean, that's sort of the focus on it, how horrible the camps were. But it wouldn't be so interesting, even though it was horrible and it was tragic, if there was some acknowledgement of, either studying these things conceptually as zones of isolation, as zones of denigration, as zones of which citizenship is no longer honored, and these are essentially become non-citizens, and which is so frightening, as a lot of scholarship has looked at, because it means anything can happen to you. You're under no legal protection. So wouldn't it be interesting to look at either that direction or examine some of the subtleties, the ways that people resisted their incarceration through education, through play, through actually contesting, through the court, the legality of their incarceration. And that if we could just look at the myriad ways it happened, I think so much of it is like, oh, this happened, there was no response to it, or the prisoners just accepted it. Feeds into this really pernicious myth about Asian Americans being very obedient and model minority, which is obviously that's the worst. It really being able to examine the subtleties of any of these cases obviously would be glorious. But I think social studies methods have such an issue around depth. But you tell me, I'm struggling with that right now with my students at Hunter College. What does it mean to really do deep inquiry versus just spending one day on a topic and then moving forward? I think that depth is so critical. And I love that you're exploring these things with these different case studies in this podcast.
Yes, definitely to grasp onto like a historical topic that you didn't experience, trying to have students understand the severity and create a connection definitely is a difficult thing. And reading your work, you talked about how you actually go to different places, specifically the Tule Lake National Museum, and how that experience felt so different for you, and how you kind of gained new knowledge just because you went to that location, like you were physically there. And I do believe that many students should experience that type of going somewhere and being there and actually learning about history. That is definitely a different type of knowledge that you can't get anywhere. So my next question to you is, how is these memorial sites, like when you visited the Tool Lake National Museum, approach education? How is that more drastic and kind of help students make that connection to that topic that they're learning?
Yes, absolutely. There is, when I reflect back on that study, which was now a number of years ago, and I think about my recent visit to my mother's birthplace in Arkansas, I reflect on this notion of the learning self, right? I borrow a lot from Elizabeth Ellsworth's work on public pedagogy, but this idea that oneself might be changed through a particular experience or a shift, a subtle shift in one's environment. And that was revelatory to me as not only a person whose family experienced this, but trying to study the concentration camp or the prison camp as a kind of site for pedagogy, as a pedagogy in of itself, the place. And in the end, when I'm like, what was the big thread of that research? And the big thread, I think, was about embodiment. When one takes one body into these spaces, and it's a very feeling driven experience and sensorial experience to enter in a space. And actually, you have to be very intentional about it because these places are in, I mean, some of them are kind of close to major metro areas, but most by design are on remote areas of the United States, public land, or in one case, the Gila River is on a Native American reservation and no one can go on it without permission of the tribal council, but they do open it up occasionally for prisoners and for researchers, FYI. But yes, you really go there with an intention. And so you watch the sort of the city, the metropolis fall away, if that's where you're coming from, let's just say, like myself. And you enter into these, literally a zone in which it becomes much more rural, much more distant from one's day-to-day experience. And by making that decision, and then entering into what was once the concentration camp, you just become so much more attuned to this past. And it prompts you to investigate, to look. Obviously, many of the buildings crumbled, they're not there, they haven't been preserved. They've been moved and used for all kinds of purposes, which is its own fascinating story of what happened to all these barracks. But they were used by farmers for the most part and others. But yeah, you have to look, and it is about that sharpening that acuity and noticing what was not there. Like I love to say, being open to being haunted. So that is the kind of learning that happens. But I've always funny. I wrote this like kind of piece for a practitioner journal on like learning through prison camps, and then they had all these teachers like read my article and kind of serve as a peer reviewer and like ask me questions about it. And I had to sort of, no, I had to, but I wanted to respond to their questions. And they were saying, how can this align with like standards and like state standards or like scope and sequences? I pretty much just had to evade all of those questions and say, well, this is actually, there's something much more profound about this learning, and it's not going to fit into any curriculum framework because it's about a mode of being, and it's about a reflective stance and sometimes shifts that are so subtle and so embodied and part of the body and the emotional self too, and one's psyche that I can't really I can connect this to social studies standards and like geography. But why is that always the question when we sort of suggest these as powerful learning spaces? So that's again that's sort of the response I've gotten when I try to bring this to broader audiences, that it might be a little bit too, what can I say, murky, ephemeral, right? Especially when you start talking about hauntology. Policymakers and teacher education people love that when you start talking about haunting. But I know I'm in the right room when I talk to you all about ghosts.
I was hoping, like, our end note was about haunting and like hauntology. I was really hoping that you could speak more about that. That was something that I found so interesting within your pieces. And when you talk about how, like, it is this like destabilizing force on the present that really allows us to like attempt to reconcile in different ways the past social violence that has occurred with like the present. And so I was wondering like if you could speak a little bit more to that, maybe like some of the examples that you've encountered in your like learning and education.
I wish I had more time to engage in this idea of cultural turn and the humanities and the such rich area of scholarship, especially Avery Gordon's work. She's a literary scholar. I think she's at UC Santa Barbara still. When you read these spectral scholars in the humanities, they're so open to that possibility that there might be something from the beyond, something that isn't part of our empirical lived or observable experience, but nonetheless constitute a kind of learning. To be haunted is to, as you said, Sam, to open oneself up for the kind of wound of engaging a violent past. To be haunted is an ethical position. It's allowing self to be changed by absorbing an experience in a place, looking at violent pictures, for example, and not turning away, reading first person accounts, reading literature. Avery Gordon writes so much about Toni Morrison, who I haven't read in years. Like she writes so much about Beloved and the specter of slavery, right? Actually appearing as a form of ghost. You can see so many myriad examples where the ghost appears as a kind of reckoning with the violent past. But the people who are haunted, of course, are not just the oppressors or the people who initiate these violent events, but all of us, in some sense, should be subjected to these ghosts. Have I ever been able to? Did you ask me if I've been able to experience them myself? I'm sad to say that I've never had, although I remember Gary Okihiro once telling me that Japanese American prisoners could see like balls of like flashing, like rolling energy balls. I think at Tulu Lake, there's like reports of that. So take that for what you will. But and I've had, when I was doing my field interviews with a lot of people who visit and keep on going back to these camps, they say that they sort of like see their ancestors or like see footprints of their ancestors on these sites. I'm not like a ghost hunter or anything. It did come up a lot in interviews and kind of long form interviewing with I just interviewed everybody who's involved in designing different kinds of learning experiences around this one former camp. I mean, people would talk about that they would sort of, a lot of them had relatives that died in the camps, especially they would sort of see them, see their shoes, see their footprint. Like again, the very famous historian Gary Okihiro, who recently died, said that he heard reports of like energy balls. So there you go. It's been recorded. It's been considered by at least one very famous academic around this history. They've legitimated these ghosts. And of course, yeah, just to admit, I mean, there is a lot of sort of death positive history too around the camps. The one in Arkansas that I just went to, I mean, there's a lot of like cemeteries of prison, of people who died in the camp, and you can visit the cemeteries. I think there's just that, and there's children who died in the camps, older people, and you can still visit their graves. Or in some cases, you can't find the graves. At my mother's camp, Jerome, the cemetery has never been recovered. It's all right for possibility, but the ghost is ultimately an absence, right? It's an absence. It's something that sort of we feel is missing, that sort of tingles our spine. And it seems to me to be all over these kind of sites. Don't you agree? I don't know. I think they are.
I would definitely agree. And it reminds me of an article that I read for another class. I think it's called like Living with the Dead, and it's about the Maya in Guatemala. and how a lot of them, and it talks about their dreams and how a lot of them like take the in the in the forensic records as they're exhuming the bodies of the Maya that have been murdered. They're also taking testimonies of the dead from from their family's dreams of them, because in Maya religion and culture, like dreams are very sacred and have like a lot of meaning within them. And so it's very interesting to see culturally like the meaning of the ghost and haunting, and how that is like so different from a lot of Western understandings.
That sounds incredible. I just typed that into my search engine, so I'm going to find that article. But yeah, dreaming. That you remind me that also came up in my field interviews, that one might still have dreams. And when I was visiting these camps and we were driving over to them, they sort of give everybody a chance to talk about why they're going back to these camps. We go on these like kind of organized trips or pilgrimages. And when everyone shares, even the very elderly people, they say, I had these dreams all the time about my father who died in camp, or I have these dreams about my sister who was in camp with me and recently passed away. So I think dreaming, yes, dreaming.
Today's episode was produced by everyone in Education, Genocide, Liberation class. Please make sure to rate us, like, and subscribe to our podcast. Follow us on Another Education is Possible. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you again on our next episode.